Now, the term liar should be used sparingly. And I say that as a British person because in our culture, being direct is like a social crime. And the word liar, it's seen as kind of crossing a line. But it is a word which should be used when it's appropriate. Which brings me onto the Labour leader, Keir Starmer. Now, I'm about to show you a clip of him just flagrantly lying on national television. This is unbelievable. Well, it is actually believable. You'll see what I mean. It's over the question of his past publicly expressed support for the right of Israel to commit war crimes. It really is wild. Just have a listen and I'll explain why this matters a lot.
Just want to remind viewers of what you said to Nick Ferrari on LBC shortly after the October the 7th catastrophe. Let's have a look.
I'm very clear. Israel does have that right to defend herself, and Hamas bears responsibility.
A siege is appropriate? Cutting off power, cutting off water?
Well, I think that Israel does have that right. It is an ongoing situation.
Cutting off water, cutting off power. Now, you lost a lot
can I just,
support when you said that.
I'm really glad you played the whole clip, so thank you for that, because when I said does have that right,
yes,
I was referring to the right to self-defence. So I was having a conversation about self-defence. Mm-hmm. I was not suggesting they had the right to cut off water or food. They do not have that right. I managed to have the opportunity to clarify that pretty quickly afterwards.
What should happen
but
now?
Starmer,
with that? Do you regret even saying that Israel has that right when it comes to?
Well, I meant the right to self-defence. I think that's clear when you see.
Did
the
you
whole
misspeak
clip.
In that clip?
In retrospect, I would have been better to have said does have that right to self-defence. Mm-hmm. I accept that. In interviews, sometimes you refer back to a previous answer.
This guy must just think we're all thick. He must think we're terminally stupid. There is no other convincing explanation that I've got available. Because what he did there is watch a clip of what he said, and immediately afterwards, he told us that he didn't say what we all, in fact, just heard him say. Now, he said he was really glad they played the whole clip, and then says when he said Israel does have that right, he was referring to the right to self-defense, and he wasn't suggesting they had the right to go off the essentials of life. Right, so we are just clear about what actually happened in the clip. You heard the clip. He said that Israel must have the right to defend herself. He always calls Israel a her, and Hamas bears responsibility. That's what happened. Then, after that, the presenter Nick Ferrari asks a completely separate question. He says, just to quote again, a siege is appropriate, cutting off power, cutting off water, secure. And then Keir Starmer says, well, I think Israel does have that right. He's not answering a question about self-defense. He's already said something himself separately about self-defense. He finishes that answer. Then the presenter asks him a different question about cutting off power, cutting off water, secure. And then he says that answering that question, that's what he does. He answers that question with the formulation that we hear him say, which is that Israel does have that right. It is totally deranged that I'm having to point out what you just heard with your own ears. What he's engaging in here is a form of gaslighting, basically where someone makes you question your own sanity or powers of reasoning. When you know something happened, but then you're told that what you experienced did not in fact happen. And I would note the sort of people who rightly denounce Boris Johnson or frankly Donald Trump for exactly this sort of behaviour, for saying something and then claiming brazenly they didn't say what in fact we all heard them say, that you shouldn't trust your lying ears, are being very quiet right now. These self-described liberals who claim that the lies of such politicians is destroying democracy, who write long, passionate screeds on post-truth politics, where are they all now? Why aren't they speaking up? Turns out their problem wasn't with dishonesty. Their problem was being on the receiving end of dishonesty, not quite the moral stance they presented it as. Now, this is a lie about one of the worst possible things you can lie about. War crimes, mass murder, and frankly, genocidal behaviour. Because Israel cutting off the essentials of life to civilians is an absolutely essential plank of their genocidal onslaught. And for those who go, well, why does it matter? He wasn't in government. Well, firstly, he's about to be in government, about to be in charge of foreign policy. So this is making it clear how he'll behave when he's in charge. Secondly, I have to suggest people who say that kind of thing, are they conscious of the racism? And you might think, well, what do you mean by that? What I mean by that is if, for example, he'd said that Russia has the right to cut off the essentials of life to Ukrainian civilians, then people wouldn't go, well, he's not government, why does it matter? They would go, well, that person has disqualified themselves from high office. They're not fit to run the country. But that's not applied when we're talking about cutting off the essentials of life to Palestinians. That's racism. But what other explanation is there? Because if you're talking about, because what we're talking about there is cutting off the essentials of life to civilians. So why would it be a travesty, which it is, if we're talking about Ukrainian civilians but not Palestinian civilians? It's racism. Crucially, what he did in that moment is help give a blank check to the Conservative government to stand unequivocally behind Israel as it unleashed genocide and mayhem. They knew they were under no pressure because their rival at the time was taken to the airways, backing cutting off the essentials of life to a civilian population, which even Rishi Sunak didn't do at the time. Now, he says he managed to have the opportunity to clarify that pretty quickly after. That's the next lie. Here's the next interview he did at the time, after that LBC interview, about whether Israel's right to defend itself includes the right to cut off the essentials of life to civilians in Gaza. He had the opportunity to just say no, with no equivocation. Did he take that opportunity? Let's have a listen.
Yes, Starmer, you've said that Israel has the right to defend itself. Does that include cutting off food, water, power to Gaza?
Well, what we've seen is appalling and shocking acts of terrorism, the murder of men, women, children, by Hamas. And so responsibility lies with Hamas, and Israel has the right to defend herself and take action in relation to the ongoing hostage situation. Obviously, this is within the framework of international law.
But does that include cutting off food, water, fuel to Gaza, where, as we know, hundreds of thousands of civilians are living?
I think that international law matters and everything should be done in accordance with international law. But I don't think that we should deflect from the fact that the aggressor here, the terrorist acts, are those of Hamas, and they bear responsibility for what is happening, the awful scenes that we're seeing in the last few days.
Astonishing. Absolutely astonishing. He could have said, as he now says in that Good Morning Britain interview, he's got no problem saying it now after the event, that Israel does not have that right. But here, he engaged in mealy-mouthed rhetoric and simply deflects back to atrocities committed by Hamas, with the implication that anything Israel does is Hamas's responsibility, which is just a means of offering a state carte blanche to behave as it wishes, because it can simply say, well, every war crime that they commit is the fault of the military force that they're ranged against. Here's another interview he did after the LBC interview. He gets asked this question again on Times Radio, and it is even worse.
Will you stand with Israel whatever they do now? Because, will you support any action they take in response to Gaza? Does that include the cutting off of water?
I want to be really clear. Israel has the right to defend herself in response to these awful acts of terrorism, cold-blooded murder, and that is the in-principle position. Obviously, everybody needs to act within international law, but I don't think at this stage we should be saying anything other than Israel has the right to defend herself.
So you're willing to write them effectively a blank moral check in that sense, to say do what you have to do?
I'm willing to sit here today looking at the terrible attacks we've seen and say Israel has the right to defend herself. And I think every right-minded politician and person and many, many people listening will absolutely agree with that. And I think we all of our thoughts and sadly condolences are with those that have been affected, impacted and sadly died as a result of this.
So he's asked whether he stands with Israel, whatever it does. Will he support any action they take, including cutting off water? The right answer there is no. Cutting off water is against international law. It contravenes, for example, Article 33 of the Geneva Convention. So, I mean, he could have done within his own moral and political framework. He could have supported, as he says, the right of Israel to self-defence, which would still have meant mass murder, by the way. But saying, well, obviously not. That includes cutting off water is clearly a war crime. But he didn't do that. What he does there is focus on Israel's absolute right to defend itself, and he makes it clear that he shouldn't no one should be saying anything other than Israel has a right to defend itself. This was when bombs were pummeling Gaza, with around as many Palestinians slaughtered by the 10th of October as the total number of Israelis killed on the 7th of October, with Israeli leaders loudly broadcasting to the world their intention to commit heinous war crimes, such as Yoav Gallant, defence minister, who declared that Israel was cutting off all the essentials of life on the grounds that Israel was fighting human animals. So what he did, Keir Starmer, as leader of the opposition and the inevitable prime minister of the government in waiting, and that is in a country which is one of Israel's main allies, is contribute to an atmosphere which legitimised Israel behaving exactly as it wishes, which is exactly what then Israel went and did, which is why we now have a total humanitarian crisis in Gaza, which Keir Starmer and his front bench are now handing about, despite having legitimised the very crimes which led to this point. And it gets worse. He sent his shadow cabinet ministers to go on TV and defend him, rather than making a statement that he, for example, misspoke. Let's hear from Emily Thornberry, Shadow Attorney General. So no big deal, just the person who'll be in charge of Labour's legal positioning. And let's hear what she said after that Keir Starmer interview back in October.
Do you think cutting off food, water and electricity is within international law?
I think that Israel has an absolute right to defend itself against terrorism.
That's not the question I asked.
It is an answer to the question that you've asked, and I think it's an appropriate one at this time.
Well, I texted her after that and said, I can't vote Labour after that. That was the end for me. She responded to whether Israel had the right to cut off the essentials of life, with Israel has an absolute right to defend itself. Disgusting, vile stuff. And she should never, ever be able to look at herself in the mirror ever again without the scenes of horror in Gaza flashing before her. Then there was Lisa Nandy, Shadow International Development Secretary. Let's hear what she said after this interview.
Do you think Israel breached international law by cutting off water and power supplies?
Look, I think this is an extraordinarily complex and fast-moving situation. There are 200 hostages.
And what's the answer to the question?
Well, look, Israel has the right to self-defence, and it has a duty to secure the release of its hostages.
Sure. But my question was,
ensure that international law is upheld.
Right, and so my question is, do you think Israel has breached international humanitarian law by cutting off water and fuel supplies?
Well, in the last 24 hours, we've seen water, medicine and food enter Gaza. It is in very limited supply.
We're not going to keep playing that because she does the same sort of answer over and over again. Refuses to condemn Israel for committing the specific war crime of cutting off the essentials of life to a civilian population. Then here's Shadow Foreign Secretary David Lammy after that interview as well by Keir Starmer.
The Human Rights Commissioner says the imposition of sieges that endanger the lives of civilians is prohibited under international humanitarian law. Keir Starmer, your leader, a human rights lawyer, says Israel does have the right to impose a siege. Who is right?
In situations of war, where there are allegations of war crimes, that must ultimately be a matter for the UN and its agencies and for the ICC. No. I'm sorry, Victoria, that is the case. This is not a moment for me to pass judgment about whether I'm not here as a lawyer.
War crimes, and neither was the UN Human Rights Commissioner. He was saying it's breaking international law to impose a siege.
He's entitled to his view.
It's not a view. It's not just plucked an opinion out of the air. He's looking at the framework, the Geneva Conventions. He says the imposition of sieges, which endangers the lives of civilians, is prohibited under international humanitarian law. Keir Starmer says Israel has a right to impose a siege. Who is right?
Keir Starmer has said right from the beginning that any war, it's important that democracies uphold the rules-based order and that must be within international law.
And
He's
I'm
said
simply
that from the beginning. His statement today says that people should have access. And I have said to you, Victoria, I'm not here as an international lawyer. That is a determination of the UN and its agencies and the ICC. It's not a determination for me. But
well, you get the picture, don't you? You get the gist there. Unable to condemn what is a grievous violation of international law, which paved the way for catastrophe. Now, a week and a half after Keir Starmer's LBC interview, he went and did this.
I know that LBC clip has been widely shared and caused real concern and distress in some Muslim communities. So let me be clear about what I was saying and what I wasn't saying. I was saying Israel had the right to self-defense, and when I said that right, it was that right to self-defense. I was not saying that Israel had the right to cut off water, food, fuel or medicines.
And yet people came to that conclusion.
Well, firstly, it wasn't just Muslim communities who were upset, and he doesn't apologise for, say, misspeaking. He just lies. He lies about what he said. What this shows is this guy is a liar. He's a pathological liar. Look, he lied through his teeth to become leader of the Labour Party. And on the most serious possible issue about life and death on a mass scale, on war crimes against civilians, around half of whom are kids, being deprived of the basics of life, imposing a death sentence on so many of them, he legitimised Israel's war crimes at that critical moment. And he then lied repeatedly about it, including today. This guy thinks you're stupid. He thinks you must be thick. But you see, if he lies about this, he'll lie about anything. And he has lied about a whole range of things. And that fundamentally is just one reason his inevitable premiership is doomed. He will win the election handsomely because the Tories have destroyed themselves. But someone this dishonest, this cynical, this unprincipled, this lacking a moral compass, well, his time in office will end in disaster. That's my prediction. But in the meantime, there is zero chance of the Tories winning. So you can vote Green or Independent, like Jamie Driscoll for Mayor of the North East this Thursday, without fearing that the Tories win. You don't have to vote for someone who legitimised horrific war crimes, including against defenceless little kids, and then lies about it repeatedly to your face because he thinks you're stupid. I would say have a little bit more self-respect than that. Please like and subscribe. Do share this video. I'd love to hear your comments. Help us take on the pro-war media as ever at patreon.com/OJones84. Listen to us on the podcast. I'll speak to you soon.